right, here we go. Today we have Natural Wonders Chapter 4, and it's all about igneous rocks. Igneous rocks are the rocks that are made from fire. Like, that's what igneous means, made from fire. So we're talking about lava, magma. And before we get into the specific rocks, there are several different paragraphs with information that you have to know for this quiz. Okay, the very first thing is something that's easy that you all probably already know, and it's just the difference between lava and magma. Okay, magma forms inside the ground and lava forms on the surface. And since magma is inside the earth, it has all of these rock layers surrounding it. And those rock layers provide insulation, which is really important for stuff we're going to talk about later. Lava on the surface doesn't have any insulation. It's exposed to the air and it cools off much faster. This brings us to the second important part of those paragraphs, and it's really tying the rate of cooling to the size of the crystals. So since lava is exposed at the surface, it cools off very fast. And magma, being inside the earth, cools off much slower with all of that insulation to surrounding rock layers. We call rocks that form from magma intrusive igneous rocks. Intrusive, just like inside the earth. Intrusive igneous rocks produce a specific texture. And this word, it's not really what you think of when you think of texture. We're not talking about the way something might feel, a texture. Texture in terms of igneous rocks is all about the size of the crystals. So a coarse-grained texture is produced with intrusive igneous rocks. And that's because intrusive igneous rocks, they cool off very slowly, and it allows different ions, different elements in the magma to slowly move to each other, produce bonds, and that produces a small mineral. But then over time, more and more mineral crystals are added, so it grows in size the longer it takes to cool. That's why extrusive igneous rocks made outside of Earth, okay, on the surface from lava, those rocks have a fine-grained texture, which means the crystals are just too small to see with your naked eye. Coarse grain, that means that you can see the individual minerals within the rock, and you can identify them just with your eye. You could look at a sample that is coarse grain, and you could identify things like quartz and feldspar, and maybe some magnetite. Within extrusive igneous rock, fine grain crystals, you can't just look at the rock and see the individual minerals within that rock. They're still there, they're just so small that you would need a microscope. The last really important information from those paragraphs is all about composition group. When we talk about composition group, we're really just talking about the color of the rock. And there's this spectrum, this scale, and on one side, it's very light colored rocks. We call those felsic. On the far side of the scale, we have rocks that are really dark. We call those mafic. And then right in the middle, there's something between intermediate composition group. And really the color is based on the minerals and the elements that are present in the rock and in what quantities. The more heavy metals, irons and aluminums and those things would produce the darker colored rock. If there are less metals, heavy elements, and there's more silica and oxygen, that'd be a lighter colored felsic rock. As we start going through these rock names, we get the rock names based on really two factors: the process and the texture, which is written right in your packet. The texture is coarse grain or fine grain, or we'll talk about some other textures later as well. And the process means where it forms and what composition the material is, the magma or lava. So if you look at the very first example, granite, it has coarse grain, intrusive, and felsic. That's the texture and process that defines what that rock is. If it had a different texture or a different process, it would be a different rock altogether. And that's really important to know. For this quiz, you will have to be able to identify the rock just by looking at it, the slides like we normally do. But then you're also going to have to be able to identify these rocks based on their texture and process. You should know when you hear coarse grain, intrusive, felsic, the rock name that should pop into your head should be granite. Moving on to our second rock, rhyolite, this is going to be extrusive, fine grain, and felsic. So the composition group is exactly the same. They're both felsic. The difference, and the reason we have two rocks here, is because of the rate of cooling where the rock forms. Rhyolite forms from lava, but granite forms from magma inside the earth, intrusive. Moving from our light composition group into the intermediate composition group, we have diorite. Rock number 3 is diorite. And if you have a direct comparison of granite and diorite in front of you, you'll be able to see that diorite has a larger portion dark minerals in that rock. And because of that greater quantity of dark colored minerals, it's going to be the intermediate composition group. It also has large crystals, so we know it's intrusive and it's coarse grained. Number 4 is still the intermediate composition group, but now we're looking at andesite. Andesite is a darker color, almost more of a gray than a white like the rhyolite. Rhyolite, being felsic, is much lighter colored. Andesite is going to be a darker gray. This is a porphyritic andesite, so you will see some large crystals, but porphyritic rocks are made through volcanic eruptions. So this rock did form extrusively on the surface. Number 5, we're going to be getting to the dark side of the spectrum, mafic composition groups. And the very first one is Gabbro. By looking at Gabbro, you can tell right away it has large crystals and it's dark colored. So you know it's coarse grained, intrusive, and mafic. That's number 5, Gabbro. Number 6 is fine grained, extrusive, and mafic, and that means it's basalt. This is what the ocean floor is made out of, and this is an extrusive igneous rock. Moving on to number 7, we have obsidian. And obsidian's texture is described as volcanic glass, glassy texture. And that's because obsidian is a lava flow, so it's extrusive, a lava flow right into water. And that's the number 1 quickest way we can cool off lava, is in water. And so this lava cools so rapidly, the ions don't even have a chance to form bonds to make even the smallest mineral crystals. Obsidian comes from the ultramafic composition group, which means that it comes from the layer below the crust into the mantle. There are 3 composition groups common in the crust: felsic, intermediate, and mafic. And there's one that comes from the mantle, and that's ultramafic, and that produces obsidian. Our very last rock is pumice. And pumice is a really cool, interesting rock, because pumice, as you can see by looking at the video, has all of these holes, these pockets. The reason it has all of those pockets is because of the gas content. Obsidian is kind of like water. Water doesn't have really any dissolved gases, but pumice formed from lava that was more like soda. Okay, you shake up a can of pop and open it, we all know what's going to happen. You're going to get that foam that shoots everywhere. And if you could instantly freeze that foam, the froth that comes out of soda, what would the outside of it probably look like? It would look like pumice, where we have these gas bubbles reaching the surface, popping at the surface, and as they pop, they produce this concave kind of hole in the surface. That's how pumice forms. Very gas-rich lava coming from the ocean floor, right into the ocean, forming these rocks that can actually float. There are so many trapped gases inside pumice, it floats on water. That's going to wrap up Natural Wonders Chapter 4. Please make sure you're trying your best to study the texture and the process, along with identifying the pictures or the video clips of each rock. And if you have questions, don't hesitate to come up and ask. Thanks.